So this is unusual. In the past, whenever we've had the Q&A with Dylan and Chris, I have sat live and been able to listen to them talk and then come up with a summary at the end. However, this time, unfortunately, I was away teaching elsewhere in the country, so Matt has asked me if I will come back and do a summary, having recorded the Q&A. It was really interesting. First of all, it was really interesting to listen to Dylan and Chris. I love listening to Dylan and Chris, and I love the fact that we have these opportunities on our online courses. And so for me, I went through and I listened, and I've kind of pulled out 4 key things, I think, for me that really influenced my thinking from what they were saying in response to the questions that were raised. So my first category is what teaching actually is. The second thing that came out for me is what learning actually is. And then how formative assessment supports both of these, teaching and learning. And then finally, how we can change our practice. And for me, it was interesting because all of the answers interlink. So everything that Dylan and Chris were talking about, even though I've pulled out discrete categories, actually they all interlink. So from my notes, which as you can see are scribbled all over, what came out for me about what teaching actually is that it's an intentional activity. And that links very much to what we've done on this course, which is about planning. So teaching can be planned for. This intentional activity of planning is actually linked to what we want the students to learn. So it's intentional, and it's for us as well as for the pupils. So we need to think about how are we supporting the pupils in their learning by what I'm planning to do in terms of teaching. And some of the things I felt that Chris and Dylan pulled out in terms of what they were discussing that linked to this were how we must be careful that we don't limit pupils. I think that was something I got from their answers, that my intentionality of planning is not a limiting, but actually a floor rather than a ceiling. So how do I scaffold that in terms of my planning? And so how do I raise expectations so all can get there? One of the key things I think that they talked about in terms of my intentionality of teaching then was how I can help students understand what my intentions are for the learning, and also my intentions of the quality of their performance in terms of success criteria, and how it's not about them generating the success criteria, they're my success criteria, but how do I help scaffold, set expectations, give exemplifications and practice in different contexts so that I know that they've learned that. So that was what I felt about teaching. And then I thought an interesting concept that Dylan and Chris talked about was this idea of models and considering what models are going to help. How do I plan to use those models? How do I plan to use different answers within models to help increase the sophistication of the pupils' thinking? So it's that intentionality of my teaching to raise expectations for all and increase the level of their thinking because of what I'm doing. And then for me, then distilling what Chris and Dylan said in terms of what learning is, it came out very clearly that, I think they mentioned it several times, that learning is about this change in long-term memory. That learning is not quick. It doesn't necessarily happen in a lesson. It might not happen across an activity, but actually the intentions of those activities to build that learning over time is going to help our pupils make progress. And so one of the things that we can help is help children to understand how they retrieve from their long-term memory. And that's that practice again in different contexts. And also that can be achieved so that their memory develops over time. And I think a couple of ideas that really resonated with me were these ideas of interleaving, using different ideas over time, and that distributed practice so that it's looking at concepts developing across time. And I thought that was really interesting then. So the teaching, the intentionality of it, and then the learning, how am I planning for that across time? So for me, the third thing that came out for me was Chris and Dylan's discussion about what formative assessment is and how that actually supports this teaching and learning. So looking at my notes, a key thing that came out from them is that formative assessment is about formative action. It's about doing something. I think that came out really loudly. It's not about just planning, it's about what am I going to do. And one of the key things they both mentioned several times was this idea about noticing. So when I'm in the classroom during that time of teaching and learning, what am I picking up? What am I developing? What am I noticing? And reflecting on those and that. And as I think Chris said it at one point, the key is that I take action. And the actions are taken to develop the pupil's sophistication in their thinking, because they have to do that learning. So I felt that they'd also discussed the importance of feedback in that. So me planning for that, me noticing what's going on, but that feedback is about improvement. It's not about doing what I'm doing, but it's about what do I need to do to develop. And I think there was lots of ideas talked about feedback, but the one that resonated with me was the importance of the teacher-pupil relationship. That I know what it means for my children, I know what's going to be the right kind of feedback at the right time, and so that feedback is efficient for that particular learner. And then finally, for me, as I said, a key thing I think that came out about formative action was that we reflect on it and that we keep refining our practice in light of what we're finding out. And that the key thing that helps us do that is evidence. So we need to decide on when we collect evidence, how we're going to do that, and we can plan for that even though we're doing this responsiveness in the moment. And then finally, the last little thing I had, which Chris and Dylan I thought talked about extensively, and it was interesting. Questions were asked at the end of the Q&A about how we help support others change practice. But actually, Chris and Dylan talked about it right at the start of the Q&A, that the important thing for them is that as teachers, we never stop learning. That we are constantly thinking, it's not that I'm not good enough, it's not that what I'm doing is not right, but actually what can I work on to develop? And I thought it was really interesting, the whole Q&A was setting up from the beginning to the end, that actually it's about this fact that I'm going to change my practice in small steps over time, whether that's 40 years, which I thought was interesting, Dylan saying 40 years at the end, but it's about the little things that I do, that I reflect on and see how they embed. And they talked about this is going to be so much more powerful if we engage in this discussion with other teachers, which is the beauty of our online courses, but also encouraging you to have an impact back in school. And I thought it was really, really powerful what they said at the end, that all teachers, no matter where you are in your career, can offer ideas and all teachers can learn. And I think that's the beauty of it. For us as teachers, learning never stops, and it's professional dialogue with each other that helps us improve. So again, a really valuable and interesting Q&A from Dylan and Chris, where ideas were discussed and debated and they disagreed. I thought that was nice. We had different perspectives brought. And as always, I've written down a plethora of research articles that they've mentioned, which I know that Matt talked about in the Q&A he's going to reference. So for you to keep that dialogue going, small steps, changes, reflections, and working with each other. So good luck, and it's been a pleasure watching it and a pleasure interacting with you on the course, so thank you.